Hi everybody. Welcome back to our class for our English 112. This is for Thursday, the 17th of September, where what I've scheduled for us is finishing up talking about the story of an hour, also beginning conversations about A Rose for Emily, and talking a little bit about the glossary of literary terms that is in your textbook. However, to begin with, I just wanted to draw your attention, and I believe I did this last class, to the opening section, the dashboard area of Moodle, where I've added a couple of new folders. One of them is for our past classes, so you can see and review what we've done during past classes. And what I want to do is just to have the particular week that we're working on outside of that folder so that you can easily access that. I also have another folder for assignment due dates, and you can see that the assignments that are going to be graded over the course of the semester are listed there. And basically what you have to do is to turn in 3 journals over the course of the semester. And each journal is in reference to each unit that we'll be studying this semester. So your first journal will be in reference to short story, and that won't be due until the ending of this month. And then your second journal will be in reference to drama, and that won't be due for approximately a month and a half after that. And then your last journal will be in reference to poetry, and that'll be due at the ending of the semester. And in terms of the journals, these are meant to be informal written responses where I am grading on a checkmark scale. Plus would be excellent. A check plus would be very good. A check would be satisfactory. And it's a place for you to indicate thoughts and reflections, observations, questions, note taking that you have about the readings that you happen to be doing. In particular, what I'm going to ask you to do is to select 3 short stories from our short story unit. You'll remember that we began our short story unit with talking about A Sorrowful Woman, and we are going to end our short story unit by talking about a short text entitled Popular Mechanics. Plus, we've got several texts, several short stories within there. Some we've already discussed, some we're in the midst of discussing, some we have yet to discuss, but by the time we get to the ending of September, we would have covered all of them. And what I'm going to do is to ask you to select 3 of those short stories and to write a written response to each of the 3 short stories. Any questions, reflections, observations, more than just plot, but your thoughts and your commentary. And most students end up writing a page in response to each short story. So they end up with about a 3-page journal talking about on each page a different short story from the short story unit. But you can do as much or as little as you like. And then once you turn that into me, I will respond back in turn, almost as if we were having a conversation in paper, and then return that back to you. I'm working on a new grading program, and we'll see how that goes. So for now, I think probably the best way for you to submit that assignment would be via my email on PDF. And if things change, I'll let you know. And of course, if you need an extension with anything, you can let me know as well, and I'll be happy to give you an extension in terms of those times. But eventually, what you will do after I return those journals to you that you've written on short story is write an academic paper about short story, which is a much more formal piece of writing. And that will be graded on a letter scale. You will have the option to revise it for a higher grade if you so desire. I am grading for both grammar and mechanics as well as for content. That won't be due until October 20th. So we've got a good amount of time to finish short story, hand in journals, return journals back, and work a little bit on the paper. And we'll talk about that paper in further depth as we continue along in the semester. And you can see that both of those assignments are in the folder that indicates assignment due dates. But then you can see the other assignments that will be due over the course of the semester. Basically for the drama unit, when we're done with drama, you will be writing a journal about drama, much like you wrote a journal about short stories. And you will also be writing eventually a paper about drama. And then our last unit is poetry, and eventually you'll be handing in a journal about poetry. But rather than writing a paper about poetry, the bulk of your final exam, which also is an evaluated graded assignment, the bulk of your final exam will be on poetry, and it's an essay exam, and we'll discuss that further in the semester. So those are the graded assignments that we have over the course of this semester. And the other responsibilities you have are to watch these class videos on Tuesdays and Thursdays, which I am posting it by 10 at the latest, though I might be posting them several hours earlier or maybe even a day earlier because I like to do things early. But definitely you can count on them being done by Tuesdays and Thursdays at 10 o'clock. And then there's an attendance question for you to respond to in our discussion forum. If you respond to the question, then basically you're marked as present for attendance. And any interaction beyond that you wanted to have with your peers or you wanted to have in our optional Zoom sessions or our optional chat sessions, you can think of that as class participation, a place where you might raise a question or raise your hand. Again, some students tend to be rather quiet and some tend to be rather vocal, so you get to decide as to how to go about your participation in this particular class. But I'll be there during our chat sessions and during our Zoom sessions to assist you in whatever way I can. You can kind of think of it as a sort of open office hour, if you will. And continuing on, you can see that today's reading included a rather strange reading. It said skim, and by skim I meant skim, the glossary of literary terms. I just wanted you to be aware that was a reference resource that is available in your textbook if you ordered the textbook for the class. That happens to appear on page 1716. It could be a very useful resource when we're talking about literary terms. So if you're not necessarily sure about a term, you can always look it up. You'll remember, I believe that I talked a little bit about foreshadowing last class, and foreshadowing is a literary term in which the author gives clues about events that will be occurring later. But you could also look up the idea of foreshadowing in the glossary if you wanted to. But I just wanted you to be aware that was a resource that was included in your textbook. What I wanted you to focus on were the two short stories that were assigned for today, one entitled A Story of an Hour and the other Rose for Emily. And if you'll remember, for the Story of an Hour, we began some conversations about Story of an Hour, gave you an attendance question to respond to that might have seemed a bit odd, where I asked you to talk about the idea of mallards. And the reason why I chose that is because that is the character's last name in the Story of an Hour, mallards. Mallard being a bird, specifically a duck. And I asked you to look up information about mallards if you weren't already aware of some of the qualities or characteristics associated with them, and to see if there were any qualities or characteristics associated with mallards that could be connected to the main character. And the point of this is that basically an author usually makes a very deliberate choice. So if they're naming a character, there usually is some significance to that particular name. I can't say that definitively 100% of the time the name is going to have significance. I mean, there could be just some sort of personal liking or disliking that led to the choosing of a particular name. But in this particular instance, I can tell you that the author, her name is Kate Chopin. You might have heard of her before. She's known as a feminist writer in the 1800s, and in fact, I study her with my students in my Women in Literature class, where we study a text called The Awakening, probably her most famous text, and it's the text that got her basically blacklisted because it was considered to be so scandalous. And it's the story of a woman who's in an unsatisfying marriage, who basically leaves her husband and children to begin a new life just a few blocks away in her own abode, and then she begins an affair, feels guilty about the affair, not because she's cheating on her husband, but because yet there is another individual that she's in love with that she would rather be having an affair with. And I don't want to give away too many spoilers about what happens in the ending if you ever read that particular text. But it was considered so scandalous at the time, and perhaps would be considered scandalous even in today's day, that this led to the ending of her career. So I mentioned this about Kate Chopin because if you know a little bit about the author, as I was suggesting in previous classes, that might give you a hint or a clue of what the author might be writing about. And that happens to be the case in The Story of an Hour, which was written in 1894 And this is a time period where women had very few rights in society. They could not vote, they could not own property. They really didn't have an individual presence. In some ways, it's somewhat similar to what we were talking about with The Sorrowful Woman, but note that A Sorrowful Woman was written decades later. So the situation of female in society was much more liberated than what you might find in the late 1800s. And that's illustrated in the piece, The Story of an Hour. And this is indeed an hour that is life-changing. And if you've ever experienced a life-changing moment, you know that that's something that can occur over seconds. And this hour basically gives us insight into this character named Mrs. Mallard, who I believe is deliberately named after a bird, in part because Kate Chopin loves to use bird imagery in her writing, and oftentimes references the idea of a bird being very similar to a female during this time period. A bird that can be entrapped in a cage, much like a female can be entrapped in the home, and a bird that can be released in order to find freedom. But the bird needs the opportunity to spread its wings and make sure that it doesn't get hurt in flight. So when you think about that and the idea that Kate Chopin names her main character Mallard, as well as many of you pointed out in your attendance question, and I encourage you to read the responses of your peers as well, mallards oftentimes have certain behaviors. Female mallards, for instance, tend to be rather dull in color as opposed to male mallards. And I would argue that perhaps that could be a connection we can make with the 1800s, where the male was oftentimes given much more attention in society than the female. And then there's certain mating behaviors associated with the mallard duck that could be associated with the idea of female and the expectation of female during the time period. Even the fact that mallards are common birds, common ducks, could perhaps be compared to the theme of the story, that while we're reading about Mrs. Mallard, a specific individual, as opposed to a sorrowful woman, one can extrapolate from that she is basically representational of perhaps other women during this particular time period. So I would say that the name Mallard was a very deliberate choice by the author. And the fact that she's referred to as Mrs. Mallard is very deliberate, because basically she's seen as an extension of her husband, Brentley Mallard. And even in today's world, oftentimes the woman's surname changes to take the male surname. Certainly that would have been the case in the 1800s. So she's referred to Mrs. In other words, she doesn't have an individual identity until later on in the story, when she's finally referred to as Louise. So that basically what we get is a transformation, as Mrs. Mallard is given information that her husband has died in a terrible accident. And basically, before that, we learn that she has heart trouble. And that's a very deliberate term that's used by the author. We only hear about heart disease at the ending of the piece. And this is a very short piece, about a page and a half long or so. And there is a difference between heart trouble and heart disease. The idea of heart trouble, or a troubled heart, since the heart is oftentimes associated with love and emotion. So this is a bit of foreshadowing that her love life is troubled, or her emotional state is troubled. But of course, it also leads to the heart disease at the end, in which she has a heart attack of joy that kills, that we'll talk about in a moment. There are lots of symbols of freedom in this piece. After Mrs. Mallard is told that her husband has died, and it turns out to be just an error, it's misinformation, but after she's been told that her husband has died, she goes off alone, and even that would have been seen as unusual in the late 1800s, the idea that females should be always accompanied, because you never know what kind of situations or difficulties or troubles a female could get herself into. But nevertheless, she goes off alone and isolates herself. And then we get references to things like open windows and roomy armchairs. This is very deliberate. The idea that a window is a way to see beyond the house and beyond the domicile into the outside world, that this is an opportunity for her to perhaps experience a new world now that her husband is no longer alive. The window is open, not closed. Again, the idea of the possibility of flight and escape. The roomy armchair. It would be a very different sense if we were told that she sat on a hard bench, But keep in mind that an armchair is designed for one person. In other words, that now she is alone. She doesn't have to think about having to fulfill the expectations of at least wife. We're never told about her having any children, so we can't necessarily compare her to the sorrowful woman in that particular way. But definitely we know that she is by herself now if Brentley Mallard has died. And the armchair is roomy, the idea that now she has this sense of freedom. As she looks out into an open square, again, another illustration of the idea of freedom and expansiveness. Reference to the idea of spring, which oftentimes is associated with renewal and regrowth. Sparrows twittering, again, more bird imagery. All of this is very positive. Blue skies. Now, there is reference to rain, and rain can be seen as a negative in some instances. But that said, rain can also be seen as a positive, as any place that's ever experienced a drought. The idea that rain can be refreshing, nourishing, and also cleansing. And the rain is leaving as the blue skies are coming in. So again, all of these are positives. And we even have a reference to a location, a direction, west. And you can think about the idea that the sun sets in the west. And perhaps this is the setting of her old life and the possibility of a new life beginning. Or we can think about westward expansion, the idea of going to the western part of the United States to begin a new life. So I would say that all of these details are very deliberately chosen, especially because the piece is so short. So every word is meticulously placed. We're told that she's young, but yet she feels repressed. Again, evidence that there was something wrong within the marriage. And she feels something creeping towards her. Creeping has a lot of negative associations associated with it. So it's not necessarily something that she wants initially, whatever that something is. But yet eventually it does come to her, and her response is free, free, free. This is a direct quote that would be wonderful to illustrate that she's beginning to feel a sense of freedom now that she knows that she's a widow. And during this particular time period, that was basically the option a woman had for freedom, because divorce wasn't an option in the way it is today. And if a woman didn't have heirs, then chances are she would inherit all of the property, which meant that she would have economic independence and freedom. In fact, it was much more rare for a woman during this time period to remarry if she lost her mate, as it would be for a male to remarry. And we can talk about all of the reasons why, but certainly I would suspect that one of the reasons would be that a single female would have a certain amount of economic and social independence that would be lost if she remarried. It's something we'll also talk about with Queen Elizabeth when we talk about Shakespeare's time, as she herself never married, in part, I believe, so that she wouldn't lose her throne. But at any rate, later on in the story, we're told again, free, body and soul free. Now, one could speculate at this point that perhaps she had a horrific marriage. There is no evidence to indicate that. In fact, she references her husband as having kind, tender hands that never looked save with love upon her. So in fact, the only evidence we're given in the text about his behavior is positive evidence of his behavior. This is less about him as an individual and less about their individual marriage, and more about the institution of marriage and what it would mean in the late 1800s for female as opposed to male. So when she says she would live for herself, and perhaps one of the most powerful lines in the piece, no powerful will bending hers, in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. And I'll reread this. No powerful will bending hers, in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. And I highlight this line because prior to this point, we've been talking about the idea of female in marriage during this time period. But this line talks about what it means to be both male and female in marriage during this time period. And the idea is that both partners are trying to impose their will upon the other. So this is a way that we can expand our reading beyond the idea of feminine or female in marriage. And note that the marriage we're presented with is a heterosexual marriage. There isn't any other option that's presented to us in this particular text. Again, not terribly surprising considering the text was written in the late 1800s. And we're told her feelings about him, that she loved him sometimes. And anybody who's experienced love probably knows that it's a quite complex emotion and that you can love and yet not love at the same time. And in the end, it's dismissed. What did it matter? That the reality is that now she has the possibilities that she didn't have previously because she is a widow, which means that she no longer is subject to the institution of marriage or her husband's will, regardless of how kind-hearted and loving he might have been. And we're told about spring days and summer days that she's looking forward to. Again, lots of positive associations with those seasons. And that previously she had hoped life would be short, but now she was hoping life would be long. In other words, she feels a sense of excitement about her future. And then, of course, the ending of the piece where we're told that this was all a misunderstanding, and it was a terrible misunderstanding at that. Her husband had been far from the scene of the accident. And the shock of it, or the assumption is from the doctors who examine her afterwards, that the shock of it and the relief of it all leads to her having a heart attack because, after all, she had heart disease or heart trouble. And she dies of joy that kills. At least from their perspective, she must be happy that her husband is alive, and it was just too much for her delicate heart to accept. And while there may be a certain level of truth to that, we know what the doctor, and we know what the sister, and we know what Richards don't know. And that basically we spent time with Mrs. Mallard or Louise when she was alone in that room, and that she saw the death not as a negative thing, but she saw it as a positive thing. So when she dies of joy that kills, it's also much more likely that she feels a sense of disappointment and dismay that the freedom that she once thought that she had is now going to be taken away from her. Now, there's been some speculation about Richards and what his motivations might be and how he could make such a mistake, but there really isn't any evidence in the text to answer those questions. If the author wanted us to follow that line of thinking, the author would have given us evidence in the text. So we have to just accept on face value that Richards just made a terrible mistake, that he's there in order to forward the particular plot. And then if we think about names, I had suggested that the sister, Josephine, doesn't really understand Mrs. Mallard. Note that Josephine is referred to by her first name. So the assumption is that she's probably not married. She's probably not involved in a relationship in the way Mrs. Mallard is. And of course, Mrs. Mallard becomes Louise when ultimately we find out the reality of the fact that perhaps she might have a certain level of liberation. Of course, it's wrong. Even the two names are quite interesting, Louise and Josephine, and both of them begin with male names, Louis and Joseph, perhaps again illustrating the idea of this society focusing on the male as opposed to the female. But nevertheless, this story does have a good number of similarities to A Sorrowful Woman, even though they were written in very different time periods. And I would not be surprised if the author who wrote A Sorrowful Woman, basically Gail Godwin, was very familiar with Story of an Hour. Story of an Hour is one of those canonical works that scholars and critics have deemed worthy of study, and it's oftentimes studied in literary circles. So chances are this Sorrowful Woman was an updated version from this particular author, Gail Godwin, from her perspective of perhaps prior literary pieces that she was aware of, such as something like The Story of an Hour. And again, I had indicated last class that the questions following the piece are quite telling because they show how the piece can be read from different perspectives based on your own individual biases and life histories, which means that ultimately a piece of literature is a very fluid thing and it changes based on the changes you experience in your life. And there are multiple ways of viewing a particular piece of literature. But your job is to highlight those elements in the pieces of literature that would support your particular perspective, much like I did in the notes and in today's video, where I was highlighting particular phrases and particular references to illustrate the idea of Mrs. Mallard feeling a level of freedom. Now, if we were to use this as an example of how to go about reading a piece of literature, now we've read A Sorrowful Woman, and we've read The Story of an Hour in a very detailed way. Perhaps we can use these techniques to read other pieces of literature. In other words, we could be moving a little bit more quickly now, because the next short story I had assigned was A Rose for Emily. And that particular story was written in 1931 by William Faulkner, also considered to be another canonical author that you might have heard of in the past. And A Rose for Emily can be a difficult read because it seems confusing. I don't know if you realize why it's confusing, but the story is told in sections, and those sections are in mixed chronological order. This is done very deliberately to try to confuse us as a reader so that we can't predict the ending. Because if the story were told in chronological order, it would be fairly simple to predict the ending. And in terms of the story, the plot, but of course the plot is the least important, not what happened, but why it happened. But in terms of the plot, we're introduced to a woman named Miss Emily. We're told that she has a somewhat domineering father who hasn't allowed her to date, and that she led a rather isolated life. She comes from a certain level of privilege, Southern aristocracy in the 1930s, which meant that she had money, and it meant that also she had prestige. And it also meant that in the 1930s, she perhaps was losing both as we see the South transition from its old system of slavery into a system where now Southern aristocrats could not rely on free labor. So that's the history of Miss Emily. And then her father dies. She takes it very badly. Even though he's been very oppressive and repressive, she holds on to his body for 3 days until finally she's convinced to release it. And then eventually she reemerges into society as a new woman, and she begins to date someone named Homer Barron, which raises a lot of eyebrows because Homer doesn't seem like the kind of person that she would ever socialize with. He is from the wrong social station. He happens to be a laborer. He's also from the wrong region. He's a northerner as opposed to a southerner. He's a laborer that's been called in to do construction in the area. And they date for a while, and there's a lot of gossip and a lot of speculation by the community about what does their relationship mean. Throughout this, we're told little details about Miss Emily's life, for instance, that insanity runs in her family. Finally, what we end up finding out is that Miss Emily goes to a druggist and she buys arsenic. She's required to tell the druggist why she's buying arsenic. She refuses to do so. The druggist is so intimidated by her that he ends up selling it to her anyway and writing the excuse that she's buying it for rats. Then she goes out and she buys a whole bunch of men's toiletries. Homer, her boyfriend, Homer Barron, comes to visit her, and then he disappears. A terrible smell comes out of her house days later. The community is afraid to confront her. Again, they're intimidated by her, so they spread lime around the property to deal with the smell. She, at that point, becomes a recluse and basically refuses to leave her home, and she's left there with just her servant. And then finally, at the very ending, she dies, and the entire community goes to her funeral, not because they're really concerned about her welfare or because they have a social connection to her, but more out of curiosity as to what she's been doing all these years and what does the inside of her house look like, which they can look at after the wake. And they go to the house and they find out that there's a room that's been boarded up, and they enter into that room. And when they open up the room, what they find is the corpse of Homer Barron. In other words, she's killed him. And again, if you were following the story in chronological order, it wouldn't be that surprising to you that she killed him. All the clues are there. In that insanity runs in her family. She has difficulty accepting death. Homer disappears, and then there's a smell that comes out of her house. In some ways, it's very formulaic. However, if you mix the sections up, then you may not have anticipated that she had killed Homer. But even if you got to that ending, there's a second ending, a much more troubling ending. And that what they end up finding, it's outside of the corpse that's lying in the bed, is a single strand of gray hair. Now, we're told in the story that Miss Emily's hair turns gray long after Homer disappears. So basically what this means is that she has been in that bed next to that corpse after that corpse has decayed. Again, a very macabre, disturbing ending. And anything your imagination can fill in as about in terms of what she did with that corpse is exactly what Faulkner wants. Rather than giving you the specific details, letting your imagination fill in whatever occurred, it's probably going to be much more horrific. It's an old technique that's used in horror fiction, which derives from Gothic literature, a class I teach. And in fact, this particular story is classified as Southern Gothic. The idea of Gothic literature, it's based in a European tradition from the beginnings in the 1700s, but mostly in the 1800s. And this is what led to our modern horror fiction, with conventions like secret passages and large castles that could be haunted with ghosts and possible supernatural elements and death and lots of dark atmosphere. And that has been basically translated over to what we think of in terms of our modern Gothic. And modern Gothic came to the United States with authors like Edgar Allan Poe, that you might be familiar with, where they were basically in the United States, but they were writing very similar kinds of tales. And in fact, there were a group of writers in the United States that were housed in the southern part of the United States that were writing in this tradition. And they were known as the Southern Gothic writers. And William Faulkner of this story happens to write in the Southern Gothic tradition. So we have all of those macabre elements that we would expect with the Gothic, but it's set in the South, the Old South, as a way to make commentary about some of the evil that existed in the Old South because of the institution of slavery. If you know anything at all about the author, William Faulkner, he was a Southerner, felt quite guilty for the role his ancestors played in the institution of slavery, and oftentimes examined that in his particular pieces. And I don't think it's any coincidence that Miss Emily is a former Southern aristocrat, and the man she's with is from the North. He's a Northern laborer. So you can view that as a kind of contrast of the old and the new world and the South as opposed to the North, if we so wanted to move beyond plot. And I had also assigned not just this piece, but an interview that William Faulkner had done about his story. Now, one of the things that you should note about the interview that he does is that that interview occurs years after he's written the story. The story was published in 1931, but the interview he gives is in 1959, entitled On a Rose for Emily. And when you read that interview, you can see that basically the author is asked questions by the interviewer about things like, what is the significance of the title? Which I've discussed with you before as well, that the title usually has some significance, which we'll talk about next class, A Rose for Emily. Or perhaps what are some of the theme or themes in the story? In other words, the idea of a fallen Southern aristocracy represented by Miss Emily. And representations are referenced in terms of symbols, where the interviewer is asking, can Homer represent the North? Can Miss Emily represent the South? And you'll see that the answers that William Faulkner gives are rather unsatisfying. There's been lots of speculation as to why he answers so flippantly. He doesn't give a whole lot of information, whether it's because he wants us as readers to struggle with the answers. He doesn't want to give them to us. Whether he's a little bit resentful that he's being asked these questions and he doesn't necessarily want to answer them, or whether it's just because so much time has elapsed that he doesn't remember the details very well of a story that he wrote decades earlier. But I would suggest that the answers we could provide to some of the interviewer's questions would be much stronger than the answers that Faulkner provides, which I know is rather arrogant, suggesting that we ourselves could do a better job than the author, since he himself wrote the piece. But I give you this piece as a way of sort of thinking about that, regardless of what an author intends or what an author says, as long as we can come up with evidence in the text to support a position, then ultimately our position is valid. So I thought that might work very well for today's attendance question, or today in our discussion form. And you can see the question also in the bottom of our notes, and that'll be due on Friday the 18th at 10 a.m. But again, if you need an extension, let me know. To identify an important quote in A Rose for Emily and indicate why you think it's important. In other words, it's all about identifying the details in a story in terms of determining what position you're going to take. I think I likened it to being a courtroom attorney, using the facts, but taking those bits and pieces that will support their particular position. So that's what you're doing. So all of you, I hope, identify different kinds of quotes so that we can get a sense as to what perhaps some of the most important quotes are. I'll talk about this in greater depth next class. And also you can see we have 3 short stories that are assigned to us. The good news is that after these 3 short stories, we only have 2 left and we're done with our short story unit. The 3 short stories I had assigned are very different from one another, and I did that deliberately so, and we'll begin this conversation next class. One is called Young Goodman Brown by Nathaniel Hawthorne. It's an older piece that's set in New England. So if nothing else, it can give us an idea of the history of New England, a place in which we all live, or I believe in which we all live, or most of us live. Again, with online classes, I suppose you could live anywhere and be taking this course, but my suspicion is that most of you are probably connected to this particular area. And if you know anything at all about New England, you're very familiar with Salem, Massachusetts, which is referenced in this particular story. That said, the language might seem a little bit archaic to you. After all, it was written in the 1800s. But that said, the themes should be timeless and universal. The next piece we'll read is entitled Soldier's Home. And that happens to be a piece about a returning soldier who's coming back from the war and the difficulty he's having reintegrating back into society. That said, even though the piece wasn't necessarily written for our particular time period, I think we can see that there are a good number of parallels with all soldiers. Though keep in mind that when the piece was written, we didn't necessarily have the understanding of things like post-traumatic stress disorder that we would have today. But that too, I think Soldier's Home is going to be a piece that you're going to find has relevance today. The writing is probably going to be much more accessible. It's one of the reasons why ultimately people tend to enjoy reading things by this particular author, because he tends to have a much more simplistic style. Sorry for that. You can probably hear my phone in the background there, but that's the difficulty of teaching from your living room. But at any rate, talking a little bit about Soldier's Home and about how ultimately that tends to be an audience favorite, if for no other reason. Ernest Hemingway tends to be an author that tends to write in a more straightforward way. But just because he writes in a straightforward way, that doesn't mean that his story is any way less simplistic than Young Goodman Brown. And then the third story that I had assigned was actually a piece from a novel. The novel is entitled Invisible Man. And it's not The Invisible Man, the story of a man who can be invisible and engage in all of these supernatural sort of events or sci-fi events. Invisible Man happens to be written by Ralph Ellison, and it was a commentary on what it meant to be African American in the 1950s and previous, and or before that. And the piece Battle Royal is the first chapter of the book that first appeared as a short story. So it's a way that we can read a short story, but we can also perhaps get a sense of the novel. I'll fill you in a little bit on some of the details of what the novel is. In my opinion, perhaps one of the best novels ever written. It really is a superb piece of writing. It also is a very long piece of writing, many hundreds of pages, and I knew we wouldn't have the time to read the novel in its entirety, but perhaps we could get a little bit of a taste when we read Battle Royal, which happens to be the story of African American who's brutalized and what that means in that particular society. So those are the 3 short stories that we will eventually be talking about. But at this point, we're at A Rose for Emily and talking a little bit about what that story means and how we can interpret it. Again, eventually there'll be a journal due, and you can certainly hand in your journals early once you've identified the 3 short stories that you want to write about. But you've got up until the 29th of September to hand in your journal, because by then we should be done with our short story unit. And In terms of the short story unit, we'll finish fairly soon because after those 3 short stories I referenced, there's just 2 left. They're both very short, about a page or so. One entitled Girl, one entitled Popular Mechanics. And then we'll move on to our next genre or category of literature, which happens to be drama. And we'll talk a little bit about how that's similar to, but also different from, short story. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And next class, we'll continue to talk about Roses and Emily and what is important in that particular piece. Take care. Bye bye.